Good morning, everyone. How are you today? Thank you. I wasn't expecting this level of participation at 8:30 in the morning, so bless you all. I really appreciate it. My name's Paul Dan. I'm with Illumio. Today, our talk is Assume Compromise, Think Like a Hacker to Build Resilience. If we break that title down for a couple of things, mainly what I want to talk to you about today are some of my experiences earlier in life as a hacker, talk to you about why I was able to be successful as a hacker in some of the attacks that I carried out, and then tie that to what we're seeing today. Quick show of hands, who's concerned about ransomware for their organization? Okay, you're in the right session this morning. So we have this disclaimer that's a requirement for all presentations at RSA. I assume you guys have seen that before. Another show of hands, who has either heard this quote or said it before? Once they're in the network, it's game over. I expect quite a few of you. Who believes that's true today? Show of hands. Absolutely. There should be more hands up. So I'll talk about Zero Trust very quickly. My take on Zero Trust, it's another 10-year phase of a repackaging of everything that we already knew about security, primarily least privilege access, absolutely mandatory. We've already known that. But what I really want to highlight today is the necessity of assuming compromise, that at some point your organization has either been infiltrated or will be infiltrated, and how are you prepared to handle that? What can an attacker do once that attacker's in your network? Some very quick considerations. I'm not going to go through all of these individually, but what I mainly want to speak to here as a hacker is that hackers are not magic. We don't necessarily know anything that you don't know. We may be thinking about things a little bit differently and applying them differently. But the basis of hacking is an understanding of the technology. That's really what it comes down to. Now, I also talk about tools working for attackers here. Threat modeling, I think I'm going to update this slide eventually and talk about SaaS. The SaaS model has been appropriated for ransomware. Ransomware as a service, as you've probably heard. This gives attackers a very, very fine-tuned way to utilize their skill sets to wreak havoc for your organization. I started out very young. I've been hacking, coding for over 30 years now. And I want to talk about some of the attacks that I carried out, both as a kid and then into my career actually doing it as a job. If you have seen the film Sneakers with Robert Redford from the early 90s, that was kind of the first point where I was able to validate that, I could do this for a living. I could have people pay me to hack into their stuff, show them how I did it, and then hopefully show them how to prevent it going forward. So let's talk about where I got into that. So as most of us young hackers did, I got in some trouble in school. I was really into bulletin board systems, cracking games, trading them for games that I hadn't played yet. And there were bulletin board systems in California, I'm from Maryland, that I wasn't allowed to call because it was long distance. My parents wouldn't let me. So I managed to find my way around the network at my high school, was able to access modems, and I started calling all these BBSs and downloading games that I wasn't able to from home. I got caught, of course, and the result of that was essentially becoming the first security administrator for my county school system. They didn't really know what I was able to do, why I was able to do it, so I helped them out with that. And that's kind of what got me started on a career of really helping organizations understand where their risk lies. I like to think of it as pragmatic offensive security research. I'm going to break into your things. I'm going to show you how it was done. Don't confuse that with pen testing. Nothing against pen testing. It has its place, but I prefer to think of security research as very focused, very, very pragmatic, not an exhaustive, here are all your vulnerabilities, but rather, this is how I'm going to get into your systems, this is what I can do to your systems, and here's how you can prevent it. So that takes us to my first real paid security assessment. It was a bank data processing center handling about 30 local bank branches' transactional data. It was in the context, if you remember, SAS 70, and it's sort of tied with CPAs, a SAS 70 audit. I was able to own this bank data processing center in about 8 minutes from sitting down on a machine. I used, actually, if you remember this guy, the Twitter whistleblower, he was also this guy in the early 90s, Mudge from Loft Heavy Industries, and they created a tool called LoftCrack. It was a Windows password cracking tool, and that's what I actually used to own that bank data processing center. It was able to gain access to one system, move laterally, find their domain controller, get the files I needed, run LoftCrack on them, and I owned it. They had RAS, if anybody from Windows 2000 timeframes is here. So I was actually able to gain remote access to an administrator account via modem in about 8 minutes. So when the Twitter whistleblower thing blew up with Mudge, it got me thinking, and I started looking back in all of my old papers, and I actually found the report that I had written in 2000 for this Bank Data Processing Center, so 23 years ago. And I wanted to kind of highlight a couple of the findings here, because even though this is older school tech, older school approaches to hacking, the numbers here are still staggering. In 3 seconds, that tool was able to crack 8 administrator passwords. Do you think that we're actually in any better position today as it pertains to passwords? Not really. And that's the whole idea behind lateral movement. Once you're in the network, it is pretty much game over, even 23 years later since I wrote this report. Physical security we know is imperative, but network security is imperative as well. And what we don't have in most environments today is least privileged network access. If I compromise one system in your organization, how far can I get to other systems, to servers, from endpoints to servers, to cloud, now all of our hybrid environments? The idea is, and I hope you're seeing the pattern here, is that lateral movement is what allowed me to be successful in all of these attacks that I'm telling you about today. And it is also what allows ransomware attackers to be successful in extorting ransom payments from your organizations. So these attacks that I'm telling you about are in chronological order, but you'll also notice that they're sort of increasing in the level of severity and the potential disruption, not just to that particular organization, but to us as a society. So I worked with a nuclear energy facility and found very much the same thing. Access to one system allowed for lateral movement to virtually any other system. And these are control systems. These are actually systems that are sitting on that border between IT and OT at a nuclear energy facility. So this was probably about 10 years ago at this point that I carried out this assessment. And again, as we continue to see more and more ransomware attacks making the media, every industry vertical is being affected, it tells me that even 10 years later, we're still stuck in that same spot where we can't seem to prevent that single compromise, that single network infiltration from turning into a legitimate cyber disaster. If you've seen Kong Skull Island, I worked with Legendary Pictures a while back to kind of assess their overall film production workflow. So I kind of traveled around the world to different film sets, to their production studios in Burbank, and exact same thing. I was able to gain access to a Wi-Fi network at this film set in Honolulu, Hawaii. And in just a couple of minutes from gaining access to that wireless network, doing some very basic network scans, the image that I have here is from my personal cell phone, and that's the live camera feed from the film set. So again, while maybe not as severe as a nuclear energy facility, being able to grab hold of pre-release content and drop it on the internet can have severe impact on revenue for these tentpole films. And as you would guess, lateral movement was the key to this attack being successful as well. So now I want to talk about the most recent attack. This was probably about 2018 that I carried this research out, and it was a really simple hypothesis that I posed. And that is, we know medical devices in facilities and hospitals, we know that those have vulnerabilities. That's been discussed at this point for decades now. But what I wanted to do is propose this hypothetical situation that as a hacker for hire, I could come into a hospital, carry out whatever I needed to do, to the point where I could actually disable monitoring systems in a specific room based on the name of a patient. Disable those monitoring systems and allow another party to physically assail that patient, hurt them or kill them, and there would be no alarms. No one would know that that patient had expired until a nurse happened to come around on rounds, which in this particular case was 45 minutes to an hour and a half. So As you probably guessed, how did I do this? Lateral movement again. And this makes for some really interesting discussions. I found through this research, and I worked with about 12 hospitals, this particular attack was carried out, simulated in just a single hospital. But the idea is that a flat network, which is really one of the biggest issues that we're facing today, is what allowed me to gain initial access. I found copiers, printers, fax machines. You know, they have those in all departments in hospitals and medical facilities. Millions of pages of PHI. So that's how I could actually identify a particular room with a particular patient. All that intake, discharge information, all being stored on these printer, fax, copy, multi things, and available on this flat network with no credentials. So if that's the case, not only does that hospital have some very serious fines that they're potentially facing for making that PHI available, but it also lets me understand who is currently in this facility, what are they in for, and which room are they in. So at the end of the day, the hypothesis was proven correct. I was able to gain initial access, believe it or not, through the Wi-Fi network in the Starbucks in the hospital lobby, pivot over to production systems, get a view of what was going on. The actual monitoring system in the room, if you're familiar with with BASH, the family of vulnerabilities, these monitoring systems were vulnerable to the whole family. So root access on this box, super simple, it was remote. And if you recall films where you have bank robbers and they rig the surveillance cameras to sort of loop 3 seconds of video so that you can't actually see that they're there. That's what I was able to do with the monitoring data that was coming from all of those patient sensors. 3-second cache, looped it, and then you can take all the sensors off the patient and nothing changes. So of course, if that patient were to die, nothing would alarm. Everything seems fine. This particular case, I think happened in 2021, and while not directly related to what I just described, it's still very much indicative of the fact that a ransomware attack, even if it's not targeting specific systems that are responsible for understanding the health of a patient, the proper care for the patient, disabling systems that were not even potentially part of the target can have a serious ramification. In this case, a child died in a hospital because they did not receive the proper care because systems had been taken offline that actually told the medical practitioners what was actually wrong with the child. Did anyone hear about this? Show of hands. Is this familiar to anyone? And the reason I talk about this in particular is because I do honestly feel, given my background, the experiences that I've had, we are on the precipice of something truly terrible, something that is going to impact us as a society if we don't get a hold of this. And at the end of the day, the real cause for this, the root cause, the ability to move laterally throughout a network unfettered, it's difficult to solve, but it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be a problem. And I'm going to tell you why I think we have a solution at Illumio to solve that problem specifically. So if we look at kind of the first idea of what is going on with lateral movement, why are attackers able to do this? Well, we know that in the past 20, even 30 years, the attack surface that's available to attackers has not only grown, but it's also diversified. So we have way more than just web servers that are sitting on the public internet now. We have everything sitting on the public internet. And it really does take just that one single network infiltration to potentially lead to a cyber disaster that could close doors, could kill people, could harm people, make things necessary for life unavailable for people. Does anyone remember the water treatment facility attack in Florida a few years ago? So that one was particularly scary. There was no real fallout from that, but if I recall correctly, I believe that I read the way that attack was actually discovered is the operator of this machine saw the mouse cursor move when he hadn't actually moved the mouse. That's what tipped them off to an attack, not SIM, not SOAR, not EDR, but because this mouse cursor moved when it shouldn't have. So if you extrapolate that, if that was missed, we could have had an absolute disaster on our hands. So when we talk about how the world has changed, I talked about attack surface. It's growing, it's diversifying, but as all of this stuff grows, as we put more and more stuff out there on the internet, we're losing visibility. We don't really understand how these systems are communicating with each other. Is it all necessary? Is it not necessary? And a really good example, if you think about network architecture diagrams, typically we have boxes that represent IP subnets. There's a box, this is HR 192.120/24. But what's going inside of that box? That's the part that we're missing. How can these systems communicate? Windows systems in particular, highly connected services like RDP, SMB, services that attackers use quite a bit in these attacks. The over-connectivity is really what our challenge is, and we haven't been focused on it. We've been more focused on how are these two networks communicating, not how are the systems within each of these networks communicating with each other and across those networks. And then, of course, breaches are more catastrophic, and that's what I mentioned earlier about being on the precipice of something very, very bad. Each of these attacks shows us just how vulnerable we are, not only as an organization, as people, but as a society. When we see critical infrastructure being targeted, when we see organizations that are critical for maintaining life, like hospitals, closing their doors, having to go to paper and pencil to actually take people into the emergency room. Those are very scary things, and we're continuing to allow it to happen. So let's talk about the impact of a breach really quick and how we've seen this sort of escalate as time has gone on. If you remember some of the Melissa virus, the Microsoft Word macro viruses and those sorts of things, those were inconveniences. That was a long time ago, but that was a productivity hit. Maybe you have to re-image the machine, do something to it, but nobody was really harmed. There was no real damage from those types of attacks. But in very little time, we've seen attacks that actually have started to cause disruption. Distributed denial of service attacks, if you remember SQL Slammer in the early 2000s. That was quite disruptive. You know, tens and tens and tens of thousands of systems around the world, Microsoft SQL servers, of course, that shouldn't have been on the internet to begin with, but they were. And they were compromised, and it caused quite a bit of disruption for organizations. But nobody died. Nobody was hurt. But now as we're starting to see these ransomware attacks really take hold, and again, as I'm going to continue to mention this, the reason these attackers are successful is because they can get into your networks, and from there, just kind of move around, unfettered. There's not a lot of detection prevention as it pertains to lateral movement today, and unfortunately, that really is our core problem. So we're starting to see these attacks have significant impact on businesses. And while it's easy to look at business impact and think of revenue, cost, it's a lot more than that. This has the ability to start impacting people's lives, whether it's people losing their lives or losing their jobs. It has the ability to cause serious disruption. And I think the final phase really is impact on society. We haven't quite seen anything of this nature yet, but I think all of you would probably agree with me that we are headed toward something like this, where we see such a catastrophic, successful attack that we as a society are impacted. The way we live our lives is impacted because of that cyber attack. So how do we address this? We talk about segmentation a lot. When I say segmentation, most of you are probably thinking network segmentation. We have firewalls with different IP subnets. We have switches with VLANs. The hospital example that I talked about earlier, they had something like 270 VLANs, I think, no access control between any of those VLANs. So at that point, it's kind of like, well, what's the point? But if we can understand how those systems are communicating with each other, bring in the idea of least privilege, network access least privilege, so that we have our application servers, they're talking to each other the way they need to power that application. But can they talk on SMB? Today, yes, probably. You have in your data center an IP subnet, 70 servers powering, who knows, 6, 12, 15 applications. If an attacker compromises one of those servers, what's the likelihood of that attacker moving into other servers? Maybe the database tier of that one app, maybe over into database tiers of other applications, because they're all in the same IP subnet. They're all talking SMB and RDP to each other to make maintenance easier. But that's what is allowing these attackers the capability to carry out these attacks and make them very catastrophic, coordinated, targeted, so that they're really, really hitting you where it hurts. And as we see, most organizations that in that situation have really no option other than to pay, hopefully to restore services, hopefully to restore access to their data, but not always. So if we want to get started on addressing this problem, the first thing that we really need to do is understand risk and have an idea of visibility on how systems are communicating. Is RDP really necessary from every single endpoint in our headquarters to all of the servers in our data center? That's a bit extreme. Hopefully none of you are working in that situation, but we see it. We see it every single day, and those are the organizations that, if they haven't been infiltrated yet, they will be. And if they haven't been hit by ransomware yet, they will be. So if we gain an understanding of that visibility, of how systems are communicating, we can start to identify risk, and we can actually start to sort of lock things down. Understand if we need all of these highly connected services to be accessible from all of these different systems. And typically the answer is no. And then we can move into something like environmental segmentation. If you think about, again, that data center subnet that I referred to earlier, how many of those servers on that same IP subnet are production? And how many of them are dev? How many of them are test? We see these environments being mixed up completely, and you can probably see why that's crazy. Because if I'm a developer and I'm on a dev box, and all I need to do is just type in a quick script to send my code over to production because it's sitting on the same IP network, an attacker can do that exact thing. And if you're thinking, well, what if they don't have the credentials? Of course they have the credentials. I mean, credentials are cheap to buy. It's a huge market, but it's also really simple to just compromise somebody's machine with malware at home and pull all of their saved Google Chrome passwords, which probably include your Active Directory, SSO, whatever credentials. And now that attacker has exactly what he or she needs to start moving around your network. The idea, in my mind, behind cyber resiliency is that we go from a state where a single cyber incident becomes a disaster to a single cyber incident becomes just an everyday case. And that's what we were talking about with assumed compromise in the context of zero trust. We need to start adapting and understanding that attackers will gain access to systems, and it can't be game over at that point because it's a reality. How many, just quick show of hands, how many of you feel like you haven't been compromised but probably have? I expected more hands, so some of you aren't telling the truth, but. So I want to talk to you about zero trust segmentation very quickly. Taking everything, all the stories that I just told you, all tying into this idea of lateral movement and being able to move around a network, poke around, look at what ports are open, what services are running, all while we have no idea that attackers are doing this. They're building out their plan. And so, whereas most organizations, when they're hit with ransomware, the first indication is the desktop wallpaper starts changing. We're getting these ransom notes dropped on the desktop, when in reality, these attackers have probably been floating around your network for weeks, maybe even months. Some cases, really sophisticated target attacks, years they've been floating around. But we don't know that part. We're not seeing all of that activity that leads up to it. We're just seeing this ransomware. In reality, that ransomware has been placed in a very strategic manner by those attackers. You hear a lot about spray and pray and that sort of thing, but if you think about it from an attacker perspective, your ultimate goal is to extort a ransom payment. What's most likely going to lead to that? It is finding your most critical assets, whether it's assets that are powering your operations, it's really sensitive information, maybe you're a law firm, it's all this information about your clients. Finding those things is critical for the attackers. So the sort of automated, self-propagating ransomware worms, they're in use for sure, but the really sophisticated attacks are usually using customized ransomware written specifically for that target, placed in a coordinated manner, and then detonated in a coordinated manner once the attackers are actually ready to carry it out. So at that point, what do? There's not much we can do. EDR, detection prevention in general, I don't want to say it's failed us, but it kind of has. The reason it's failed us is because we've relied on that strictly, and we have not typically taken a defense in depth approach. So when we're relying on detection and prevention to stop all of these things from happening, but we also know that detection and prevention doesn't work consistently, it's not effective 100% of the time, what are we really left with? We're left with attackers gaining access and moving around our networks and wreaking havoc, and probably ruining somebody's day. The Illumio Zero Trust Segmentation platform is built specifically with the modern ecosystem in mind. We have these hybrid environments. We still have some servers sitting in data centers. We have lots of cloud stuff. We have servers and data centers talking to stuff in the cloud, and these are all pathways that attackers can use. That's really what we're trying to do, is identify those pathways, determine if they're actually necessary. If I block these ports, is my application going to die? If it's not, why are these ports open? We'll close them. That's really what Illumio segmentation is about. It's about providing visibility into exactly what attackers are able to utilize in their attacks, and then blocking those pathways off. I'm actually just going to skip through this slide. It takes a very long time to build out. Now, think back to what I was talking about earlier with those network architecture diagrams. We have our blocks that represent HR, and this is HQ, and this is finance over here, and they're all different IP subnets. But at the end of the day, this is really what we should be looking at. What systems are in those boxes? What systems are on those IP subnets, and how are they communicating with each other? And if an attacker compromises one of those systems, what's going to happen from there? And this is the scenario that ultimately we're used to. One infiltration leads to the entire organization being compromised. Whereas we should be looking at it like this. Instead of these boxes that just represent individual IP subnets, understanding what's going on in those boxes. And if one of those systems is compromised, what is it that happens? Sorry about that. In this particular case, we know that a compromised system in our data center, while we don't necessarily want that, containing that attack to just that small set of systems is way better than what we were just looking at previously. That example I gave where we have a data center subnet, 70 servers running 6 different applications, and that attacker now has access to all of them. That's what we want to avoid, and that's really what Illumio is doing for our customers, providing you with a level of visibility and understanding of those lateral movement potentials and closing them off so that as an attacker, if I gain access to one system, I start running network scans, port scanning, all that stuff that hackers do, and I'm seeing 1, 2 boxes with a couple of ports open. That's not very promising for me as an attacker, where I want to find your most critical assets and then extort you for a ransom payment. I'm probably going to move out of that network and then go find a much easier target because they're out there. But that's really where we need to be. That's what gaining resilience ultimately means, is that we can tolerate network infiltration by attackers, on the part of attackers, and survive without the concern that we're going to lose our business operations, that our revenue is going to be impacted, the healthcare of our patients are potentially impacted. That's really what the problem that we're trying to solve with Illumio. So applying what you've learned today, what I really encourage you to do, obviously swing by the Illumio booth and talk to us. We can give you a demo, we can get you set up with evaluations, but the most important piece that I can convey to you is start taking inventory of your critical applications. Understand what are those potential lateral movement pathways that attackers could utilize to ruin your day. And then from there, understand how those application servers are communicating with each other. What ports are being used, what services are open, all of that normal stuff that we talk about every day in conference rooms. Start applying that to what you see in these data centers and start thinking about it from the perspective of a hacker. If I gain access to this one system, what can I do with it? My guess is you're probably not going to like the answer that you find. You're probably going to find that gaining access to one system in your environment is going to lead to access to a lot of other stuff, and we don't want to have that happen. The final phase that we need to achieve, and I've talked about this a couple of times now, is the ability to have someone compromise a system on your network, and it's just an everyday occurrence. We can quarantine the system, we can take it offline, we can re-image it, whatever it is that our operations people do. But primarily, we need to get to the point where a single system compromise stays a single system compromise in your environment. That first system that's compromised by an attacker is the last system that's compromised by the attacker. I'm finishing up pretty early, so I want to see if there are any questions that I can answer for any of you. That means I did a really good job. Awesome. Yes, please. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. So the question is basically, when it pertains to healthcare facilities in particular, the connectivity of devices. What does that look like? How can we address the risks that come with that? So digging in a little bit more on that example, the research that I talked about with attacking the hospital, some of the other devices that were there for sort of ripe for the taking, check-in kiosks, believe it or not, both for patients and vendors. Using really simple vulnerabilities and gaining access to those systems gave me a network foothold that allowed me to sort of move around. And at that point, I wasn't even actually in the hospital yet. I'm still in the lobby messing with these kiosks. But now I have network connectivity kind of all over the place. So to answer your question, I think directly, the same thing applies in terms of how we lower the risk of attackers moving around, finding those critical systems and bringing them down, disrupting operations. It comes down to understanding what's in the environment. When you think of a multi-function printer, copier, fax machine, you don't really think like this is going to be really advantageous to a hacker. But as it turns out, it is. So my advice there, and this is certainly applicable to healthcare, but really everything, is understanding what's on the network, understanding what it does. Does it need to be there? Does it need to be accessible to everyone the way it probably is today? And then doing something about that. And what that something is ultimately is segmentation, but at a much granular level than what we're used to. Not segmentation by just creating a new IP subnet off of a firewall, but segmentation at the host level that's really locking all of these systems' ability to communicate down to only what's necessary. It is easier said than done, for sure. Yes?
So I'd like to know what do you do for the white noise, and are you whitelisting more across the network? Because all the network services are trying to phone home, and usually that's where you find your data in the white noise. Or you have too much white noise and you can't find the data that you're looking for.
So if anybody couldn't hear, what are we doing about white noise? Are we whitelisting more? So I'll tackle the second one first. When we look at what Zero Trust tells us with least privilege, we are really talking about allow only. The sort of allow these things, block everybody else, that's really the only model that works versus allowing everyone and then let's just block these particular things from being able to use the system. So that's really the first piece. As far as the white noise, I think our challenge has been, the need for deep packet inspection and understanding what's going on inside of these packets. We're not ready for that. We haven't been ready for that. When we have systems that are communicating kind of all ports, all systems, looking at what's actually in those packets is not the first thing we need to be doing. So the white noise is there, and it's always going to be there. But if we understand, first and foremost, what's generating the white noise, and if it needs to even be generating it, we have a lot less white noise to worry about. Answer your question? Perfect. Yes? Mhm. Mhm. Come by the Illumio booth. But yeah, I mean, microsegmentation, that's another one of those terms that's kind of, it's markety, but kind of makes sense from a technical perspective. But it really does center on what we're talking about here, and that's the fact that segmentation traditionally with firewalls leaves a lot of potential lateral movement pathways available for attackers, and we're seeing the results of that. So in my mind, microsegmentation, it is a thing, and the way we achieve it is not using network devices, but rather using host-based capabilities that are using, in our case, operating system firewalls, not create your own firewall, but Windows has Windows filtering platform. Most people think of the Windows firewall. Windows firewall is actually just another Windows application, like anything else. Windows filtering platform is a set of APIs built into Windows that allows you to filter traffic. The Windows firewall uses that set of APIs. Our product does as well. And the idea is, particularly with Windows systems, why are all these ports open and why can all these machines hit those ports when there's really no reason for it? Answer your question? And definitely swing by the Illumio booth. I think you'll find that we do have a good solution for it. Any other questions? Yes, please. Yes. Absolutely. Right. Mm-hmm. I do. I hadn't talked about threat modeling, but yeah, I mean, it's one of the first steps. And another show of hands, does your organization do threat modeling that you're aware of? Okay, a little bit. I mean, it really is the first step. And threat modeling can be confusing for a lot of people. It can be very intimidating. Think of it more as just, as the title of my talk says, think like an attacker. So if you know there's critical assets out there, and you know that those are probably what the attacker is going to be going after first, definitely start with understanding how that critical, whether it's an application, it's a set of data, understand how it works, how it communicates with other systems, and then determine if all of that is actually necessary. And in most cases, it's not going to be. Mm-hmm. And that's where the visibility comes in. And one of the first things that the Illumio product is doing is gathering all of that network traffic information on how these systems are communicating and then visualizing it for you, building you a map that's not just a square with an IP subnet in it, but all of those systems that sit in that subnet and how they're communicating with each other. If you're talking, I'm picking on Windows, obvious reasons, but if you look at a typical Windows network, Windows servers powering an application, not user endpoints, but most of those servers can usually connect to each other over RDP. They can share files and printers using SMB. Why? Why do those application servers have to have that connectivity? They probably don't. Cutting just those two services off in a Windows application server environment reduces your ransom risk extraordinarily by just cutting off that type of connectivity, chatty Windows services. So now when an attacker compromises that one, we'll say they've compromised the web tier. So they're sitting on a web server. In reality, your standard 3-tier web application, web processing database, there's a very, very small, finite amount of network traffic between those tiers that's actually required. But if you look at a map of what is actually happening, you're going to see flows going all over the place, outside of that application, but also within those application servers, and it's mostly unnecessary, but ripe for grabbing by attackers and wreaking havoc. We've got 10 minutes left. Can I answer any other questions? Yes, please. So the question, if you couldn't hear it, is what's the value of honeypots, deception? So I think the idea of honeypots in terms of just tracking attacks for analysis, it's useful. I don't think it's a valid first step. I think most organizations have a lot more work to do with controlling lateral movement versus employing something like honeypots. I think that's later, after, when I ask the question, how do you feel about an attacker getting into your network and moving around laterally? If you're able to say, I feel really good that we've got that under control, now let's put honeypots in place. Because I mean, that data that we can gather, the ability to analyze attacks as they're happening is very important. But like any other technology solution, that requires money and resources to operationalize it and keep it going. And I don't think most organizations are ready for that yet. Not in the context of what we're talking about today. Thank you. Any other questions?
Paul,
Yes.
so implementing zero trust in an organization, like you said, the first thing is to identify your assets. Now, having visibility into all your assets sometimes becomes really difficult,
Yeah.
especially if you have departments that are really segregated. And even when you go to different departments and you ask, can I have a list of all your assets? They're struggling to populate a full list. So when you work with organizations to help them implement zero trust, how do you help them populate their full list and help them identify their crown jewels? And the other thing I've seen is that when we talk about zero trust, when we talk with vendors, they say SSE is now in the market. And zero trust is just a component of SSE. And we look at SWG and KSB as being part of SSE, and organizations that have difficulty in implementing zero trust straight away within 6 months, because that becomes unrealistic for small organizations with small teams and
Yes.
budget restrictions. How do you help them decide what to adopt fast to work towards zero trust? Thank you.
Great question. So a lot of acronyms. That's another one of our problems. We've got to create a category for everything, it seems, these days. You're right that, and I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we have with security solutions today, is that all organizations, small and large, have pretty much the same security challenges, but the solutions that may solve those challenges are not available to all orgs because of budget, because of staff limitations. So when it comes to figuring out what's out there, I think we have to understand that organizations have to come together and start sharing information. You mentioned very siloed, segmented organizations. We have to break that down. But at the end of the day, the first step really is gaining visibility. So let's say you deploy an agent to one system that you know is out there, and then you start building a list of all the systems that talk to it, all of the systems that it's talking to. All of a sudden, you may have hundreds of systems that some which you knew about, a few that you probably didn't know about. And when we go into customer environments to start an Illumio implementation or a proof of concept, one of the virtually guaranteed things that we will deliver are servers that we thought were decommissioned 3 years ago are still out there. Ports that we thought we closed down a month ago are still open. Those are the types of discoveries that are really important for organizations large or small.
And the other challenge, I guess, would be shadow IT.
That's a whole other issue. But the thing about microsegmentation, I think, and our approach at Illumio is that we can sort of work outside of those types of constraints. When we talk about measuring network connectivity, it's a pretty black and white scenario at that point. Even though we may not know what a system does and why it's out there, we thought it wasn't even out there for a long time. Now we know it's there. Now we know how it's communicating with other things, and we can start to really reduce risk by eliminating pathways to and from that system that attackers are most likely going to use that don't need to exist. We've got 5 minutes. Any other questions? Please.
A lot of zero trust discussion at the end seems to focus more on the identity piece.
Yes.
Your approach seems a little different. You start with the network segmentation, which makes sense too. In your kind of view, do you assume that the identity is already done?
It's a good question. So if you weren't able to hear that, the question was kind of, where does identity come into play? A lot of zero trust conversations sort of revolve around identity, and that's true, and identity is critical. But going back to one of the first things I talked about with, once they're in your network, it's game over. When we talk about least privileged network access, there is a point to which we can reduce risk by limiting that without even knowing identity. So the data center with all of our application servers, and they're all communicating SMB with each other, we probably don't need that connectivity to begin with. So identity doesn't even really factor into it at that point. I think almost along the same lines as using honeypots and deception technology, the idea of identity has to sort of come later. The idea right now is risk reduction, particularly as it pertains to ransomware. So if we drop RDP and SMB connectivity across the entire data center, except maybe we need our RDP connectivity in from a couple of jump boxes where admins are working from. If we constrain connectivity down to just that, without even factoring in identity, we've reduced the risk of ransomware tremendously because those pathways that are most likely going to be used have been eliminated. Identity can then come in. So when we're talking about we do need RDP access to these particular systems from these systems, that's where we can factor in identity as well, whether it's Active Directory group membership or specific users, whatever the case might be, hopefully not specific users. But that's when identity comes in. So I don't want to say that it's not important, because it definitely is, but it's a little bit post initial risk reduction in my mind. Thanks. Any additional questions? And thank you all for these questions. They're really great. I'll go wrap it up. Thank you.